What would you do if a cop kicked your pregnant wife and walked away like nothing happened? This is not just a headline, it's a wake-up call. A moment caught on camera that shook a city and sparked a movement. Stay with us, because the truth behind this story will leave you breathless. Watch until the end, hit like, and subscribe now. This is the kind of story you'll never forget, and the kind of justice we need to fight for together. It was supposed to be a quiet, normal afternoon. The kind where nothing much happens, where people go about their lives without thinking twice. For Danielle Harris, it was just another walk home. She had just finished her shift at the local library, picked up a small bag of oranges for her husband, and was strolling down a tree-lined sidewalk with one hand cradling her 8-month belly. She wasn't in a rush. She wasn't thinking about anything except getting home and surprising Malik with his favorite dinner. It was the kind of day that felt soft around the edges, where the sky stretched wide and the air smelled like possibility. But all of that changed in an instant. As Danielle turned the corner near 4th and Walnut, a police cruiser pulled up beside her. At first, she didn't think much of it. The engine was loud, rumbling low like it was sizing her up, but she kept walking, slow and steady, her other hand still gripping that paper bag. Then the car came to a hard stop. The door slammed open. A tall, heavy-set officer stepped out, Officer Brian Keller. She had never seen him before, but his presence sent a chill down her spine. He barked a command at her, sharp and loud, and suddenly it felt like all the warmth had drained from the day. Danielle stopped walking, confused and a little afraid. She answered him calmly, explained she was just heading home, but his tone only grew harsher. He accused her of loitering, standing suspiciously, even though she had done nothing wrong. Without warning, Officer Keller advanced toward her. Danielle placed her hand on her stomach instinctively. Her heart was racing. The sidewalk beneath her feet suddenly felt unsteady. She tried to stay calm, said she wasn't arguing, just walking. But her words didn't seem to matter. Keller shoved her, hard. She stumbled backward, the bag of oranges falling to the ground, bouncing across the pavement like marbles. She barely had time to brace herself before her body hit the concrete. Her hands instinctively wrapped around her stomach, trying to protect the life growing inside her. Pain shot through her, sharp and deep. But it didn't end there. In a moment so violent it barely felt real, Officer Keller kicked her in the belly. Not once. Not a hesitation. Just one swift, brutal motion. The impact was quiet, but the silence it left behind was louder than any siren. Danielle let out a cry that tore through the air. Her body crumpled. Her world went black around the edges. People nearby froze. A few gasped. One woman screamed for someone to call 911. A couple of bystanders pulled out their phones, recording the aftermath, but no one stepped in. No one stopped it. Keller turned his back like she was nothing, like she wasn't someone's wife, someone's mother-to-be, someone worth seeing. And maybe to him, she wasn't. But the camera saw everything. The lens captured what witnesses couldn't unsee. A pregnant black woman brutalized on a public sidewalk by someone meant to serve and protect. The video was only 40 seconds long, but that's all it took. The footage spread like wildfire. Within hours, thousands of people had seen it. By the next morning, it was national. Her name, her fall, her scream, it was all out there. But for Danielle, all she could think about in that ambulance, with her body trembling and her eyes locked on the ceiling, was one thing: her baby. And for Malik Harris, who would receive that phone call and walk into the hospital to see his wife bruised, broken, and afraid, it wouldn't just be a personal tragedy. It would become a mission. One that would shake a city, and expose the kind of truth that institutions spend decades trying to hide. Malik Harris had always been a calm man. Not the kind to raise his voice or make a scene. Years in the Marines had taught him the value of steady hands and clear thinking, especially under pressure. But nothing prepared him for the sound of his phone ringing that afternoon. The voice on the other end was calm, too calm. A nurse from New Hanover Regional said his wife Danielle had been admitted. She was in critical condition. There had been an incident. She was asking for him. That was all it took. He didn't remember the drive. Just red lights ignored, a steering wheel gripped tight enough to leave marks, and his own voice in his head, repeating her name over and over like a prayer he didn't know how to finish. When he stepped into the hospital room, it was like the world narrowed into one image. Danielle lying pale and bruised against the white sheets, a monitor beeping beside her, and her hands resting gently, protectively, over her stomach. For a second, all he could do was look at her belly. Still rising. Still falling. She was alive. Their baby was still there. The relief was so sharp it hurt. But then she turned to him, her face swollen, and said what would become the spark for everything that came next. She told him she had been kicked. In the stomach. By a cop. It didn't sound real, but the look in her eyes said everything. Malik didn't break down. He didn't yell. Not then. He sat beside her, took her hand, and whispered that he was there. But something inside him shifted. It was like a switch had flipped, some old part of himself reactivated. He had spent years learning how to respond to crisis, how to focus under fire. And now, sitting next to the woman he loved, carrying the child they had dreamed of, he knew this wasn't just something that happened to them. It was something that had to be answered. That night, while Danielle slept, Malik pulled out his phone and watched the video for the first time. It was short, just under a minute. He saw her walking. Saw the officer stop her. Saw the shove. The fall. The kick. And then heard the sound that would haunt him. The sound of her body hitting the concrete and her cry slicing through the quiet. He didn't sleep. He just watched the video over and over, memorizing every frame, every detail. The officer's name. The faces of the people filming. The indifference. The silence. He knew in that moment that this wasn't going to be something the city could ignore. Not if he had anything to say about it. The next morning, he reached out to an old friend from his military days, David Reed, who was now a civil rights attorney. They hadn't spoken in years, but Malik didn't hesitate. He sent a simple text, explaining what had happened. The response came almost immediately. David was in. And just like that, the first step toward something bigger began. Malik wasn't thinking about media or protests. He was thinking about accountability. About what it meant to make sure this didn't happen to someone else. He didn't care about revenge. He cared about responsibility. While the world reacted to the viral video, Malik started organizing. He pulled documents, made calls, talked to witnesses. He reached out to Tanya Blake, a civil rights lawyer with a reputation for not backing down. She had taken on cases like this before, but this one was different. This was personal. The footage was undeniable, the damage real, and the story impossible to ignore. Malik laid it all out. Not just what happened to Danielle, but everything she had been robbed of, her peace, her safety, the joy of late pregnancy, the quiet life they had been building together. He wasn't a politician or a celebrity or someone used to the spotlight. He was just a man who loved his wife and refused to let her story become another headline that faded with time. And as the messages poured in from strangers across the country, as candles began to gather on the steps of the hospital, as old veterans and young mothers stood side by side holding signs with Danielle's name, Malik knew this wasn't just his fight anymore. This was a moment that had chosen him. And he wasn't going to let it pass. Not when the cost had already been so high. Not when the truth was finally, painfully, unmistakably in the light. The days after the attack moved fast. Too fast. Danielle was still in the hospital, recovering slowly, one eye always flickering to the door any time footsteps echoed down the hallway. Malik stayed by her side when he could, holding her hand, helping her eat, listening to her breathe. But when he wasn't there, he was working. He had shifted into a different gear, one that didn't allow space for anger without action. There was too much to do. Too much to uncover. And deep down, he knew what happened to Danielle wasn't a one-time failure. It was a symptom of something much bigger. With the help of David Reed, his former squad leader turned civil rights attorney, and Tanya Blake, a sharp and relentless lawyer who had built her career around accountability, Malik started gathering everything he could. They pulled Officer Brian Keller's service record. The first shock came fast. 3 prior complaints of excessive force, 2 involving black residents, 1 a woman nearly Danielle's age. All of them marked closed. No follow-up. No suspension. Just gone. Like they never happened. Tanya leaned back in her chair and shook her head. This was more than negligence. This was protection. They dug deeper. Internal memos started to appear. Notes scribbled by supervisors flagging Keller as aggressive and prone to overreacting. One evaluation said he was not suited for field work. Another highlighted how he had trouble de-escalating situations. And yet, he was still out there, in uniform, with a badge and a gun. The pieces didn't add up unless you were willing to look at the system for what it was. A machine built to cover for itself. Malik read through every page, every line, with the quiet intensity of a man who wasn't going to be surprised again. Each document was a reminder of how many chances had been given to someone who saw Danielle as less than human. One night, Tanya handed him a sealed manila envelope. Inside were anonymous statements from officers still working within the Wilmington Police Department. They told stories of Keller harassing people in black neighborhoods, using unnecessary force, intimidating younger officers who spoke up. One officer said he had filed a report once and watched it disappear. Another wrote that Keller had a reputation, one that everyone knew but no one addressed. Malik sat with those papers in his lap for a long time, his hands trembling just slightly. They knew. They all knew. And no one had done a thing. He thought back to Danielle lying in that hospital bed, still flinching when someone raised their voice too quickly. He thought about the baby they almost lost. And then he thought about all the other families, the other names, the other silences that had never made the news. This wasn't about a rogue cop. This was about a culture that had been allowed to rot from the inside. Tanya and David agreed. They needed to go public with more than just Danielle's story. They needed to show the patterns, the buried files, the warnings ignored. They started building a timeline, charting every missed opportunity to stop Keller before he got to Danielle. It wasn't just paperwork. It was a roadmap of failure. A blueprint of how injustice hides in plain sight, buried under red tape and bureaucracy. Malik watched it all come together with a kind of cold clarity. This was bigger than his wife. Bigger than their pain. This was about every person who had ever been silenced by a system designed to protect itself first and the people second. By the end of the week, they had a binder filled with documents, names, and timelines. And that binder was only the beginning. Malik started meeting with community members, faith leaders, and journalists willing to listen. He didn't shout. He didn't accuse. He showed them the facts. He let the truth speak for itself. And the truth was loud. People started showing up. Not just to support Danielle, but because they saw themselves in her story. They had been stopped. They had been harassed. They had been afraid. Malik had cracked something open, and now there was no going back. For the first time, the silence that had allowed people like Officer Keller to thrive was being replaced by voices that refused to be ignored. And Malik, steady and focused, knew this was the real beginning. The moment when the truth wasn't just exposed, it was finally being heard. The shift didn't happen all at once. It started in small ways. First with the candles outside the hospital, then the handwritten signs that read justice for Danielle, then the quiet crowd that grew by the hour. Malik noticed it the morning he stepped outside for air and saw faces he didn't recognize holding space for a woman most of them had never met. Church elders, war veterans, college students, single mothers, they all stood shoulder to shoulder without shouting, just present. There was something powerful about it, something rooted in quiet defiance. Danielle's pain had lit a fire that no one could ignore. Inside the hospital, Danielle was healing slowly. The bruises on her face had started to fade, but the fear lingered. Loud noises still made her jump. The sight of a uniform passing in the hallway tightened something in her chest. But when Malik told her about the people outside, about the video being shared by millions, about strangers calling to say they believed her, something softened in her expression. For the first time since the attack, her voice carried more than pain. It carried purpose. She looked at Malik and told him they couldn't let this moment go by. If people were listening, they had to speak. Malik was already thinking the same thing. He wasn't just a husband anymore. He had become a voice for something larger. Every interview he gave, every community meeting he attended, was about more than what happened on that sidewalk. It was about the pattern, the silence, the protection, the people left behind. He started speaking at local churches, showing up on podcasts, giving interviews not to vent but to focus attention. His voice was calm, never shouting, but it carried weight. He spoke like a man who had nothing to prove and everything to protect. Their son was born just weeks after Danielle left the hospital. They named him Truth. It wasn't a name they had planned, but it felt right. Every time Malik looked at him, he remembered why they were fighting. This little boy had already survived a storm. Now he deserved a world that didn't try to swallow him whole before he could even stand. Danielle held their son with the kind of tenderness that made people stop and look. Her strength wasn't loud, but it was steady. She had faced something most people couldn't imagine and come out still choosing love. Still choosing to show up. Together, Malik and Danielle decided to launch something bigger. A campaign. A platform. A movement. Not just for Danielle, but for every person who had ever been hurt and forgotten. They partnered with Tanya and David to start mapping out a formal initiative, something that could carry this momentum forward. They didn't have a name yet, but they had a mission: accountability, reform, and healing. Malik began working with local organizers to bring town halls to neighborhoods most often ignored. Danielle started journaling her experience, turning pain into written testimony that she would one day share with young women facing their own battles. The public response was overwhelming. Donations came in. Volunteers signed up. Survivors of police violence reached out with their own stories, many of them untold until now. The movement wasn't just about punishment, it was about change. Malik made that clear in every speech. This wasn't about one cop. It was about the system that let him operate unchecked. And the people were ready. They didn't want another hashtag. They wanted something lasting. What started on a sidewalk had turned into something no one expected. A young family, almost torn apart, had become the face of a growing demand for justice. Danielle's voice, once nearly silenced, was now reaching classrooms, boardrooms, and living rooms across the country. Malik's calm presence became a source of strength for others, a reminder that real leadership doesn't always come with a title. It comes with purpose. They weren't activists by trade. They hadn't trained for this. But their love, their pain, and their refusal to stay quiet had built something powerful. The story that could have ended in tragedy had become a spark for transformation. And even though they were still healing, still finding their way through the wreckage, one thing was already clear: they were no longer just survivors. They were builders of a movement that wasn't going away. Not now. Not ever. At first, the support was overwhelming in the best way. Malik and Danielle felt surrounded by love, by energy, by people who showed up without being asked. Their son, Truth, was growing strong, and their living room often looked more like a command center than a family home. There were boxes of files, stacks of community notes, sticky tabs on the windows, coffee cups half full at every corner. But underneath the momentum, Malik started to feel a shift. It wasn't loud, not at first. It came in the form of phone calls with no one on the other end. Anonymous emails with vague warnings. Online comments that twisted their story, suggested Danielle had provoked it, that Malik was just seeking attention. It would have been laughable if it didn't feel so calculated. Then came the building inspections. One morning, officials showed up at the Veterans Center Malik ran, clipboards in hand, pointing out violations that had never been mentioned before. Suddenly, his non-profit status was under review. An application they had filed for city funding went mysteriously missing. These weren't coincidences. They were pressure points, and Malik knew it. The system had begun to push back, quietly and strategically. But he also knew what they didn't, that he was used to pressure. He had felt it in war zones, in dark hospital rooms, in quiet moments where fear could swallow a person whole. This wasn't new. It just had a different name. Danielle could sense it, too. She wasn't as mobile yet, but she could read the tension in his shoulders, the long pauses before he answered his phone. They spoke at night while Truth slept, voices low but steady. She reminded him that what they were doing mattered. That change always made people uncomfortable. That silence was easier, but it never healed anything. Malik listened, grateful for her strength. He never admitted it out loud, but her words were the reason he kept going. The attacks didn't stop him. If anything, They sharpened him. Malik doubled down, meeting with organizers, educators, and local business owners who had begun to quietly voice their support. He knew the city was watching, trying to wear him down, but he also knew they were underestimating just how focused he could be. With Tanya and David by his side, they began working on what they called the Celeste strategy, a multi-layered plan to hit the system from every angle. Legal pressure, media narratives, community action. The goal wasn't just to hold one officer accountable, it was to peel back the entire culture that had allowed someone like Keller to thrive. Meanwhile, Danielle started speaking out again, this time from a different place. She gave interviews from home, joined virtual forums on maternal health, and started connecting with Black women who had faced discrimination during pregnancy. She didn't want to relive her trauma, but she refused to let it be wasted. Every time she told her story, it was like a piece of it transformed into something stronger, something that could lift someone else. As the weeks passed, Malik began receiving more support than resistance. Veterans he hadn't spoken to in years reached out. Faith leaders from other cities asked him to speak. Civil rights groups offered resources, legal aid, funding. A few brave officers even contacted him anonymously to say they believed him. They just couldn't say it publicly. That kind of quiet courage meant something. It reminded him that change didn't always need a microphone. Sometimes it started with a whisper. But Malik also knew whispers alone wouldn't protect his family. He started traveling with protection, made sure Danielle had someone with her whenever he was away. He wasn't afraid for himself. He was afraid of what desperate people might do when the old ways stopped working. Still, he didn't flinch. He just kept showing up, at rallies, in town halls, on the news, in rooms where he wasn't supposed to speak, speaking anyway. The pressure didn't break him. It refined him. And as Danielle watched him take the stage again and again, she saw something new in him, not just grief or fire or purpose, but leadership. Real, grounded, unshakable leadership. He wasn't just telling their story anymore. He was building something far bigger than either of them imagined. And no matter how hard the city pushed, Malik had already decided, he wasn't going anywhere. The courtroom felt colder than Malik expected. Not physically, but in atmosphere. The kind of cold that wrapped around your chest and sat heavy. Everything was quiet, too quiet. Reporters sat with open notepads. Community members filled the benches in silence, their eyes fixed ahead. Danielle was there, sitting beside Malik in the front row, her fingers gently wrapped around his. Her grip was steady, but her hand was cold. They had waited months for this moment. For the chance to sit in a room where truth couldn't be ignored. The system had delayed, deflected, tried to settle quietly. But Malik and Danielle had said no. They didn't come for apologies or closed-door deals. They came for truth. And now, the truth had a seat in court. Officer Brian Keller sat at the defense table in a gray suit, not in uniform this time. He didn't look at Danielle. His jaw was clenched, his eyes scanning the room like he was still in control. But something in his posture had changed. There was no badge to hide behind now. No department statement to shield him. He was just a man answering for what he'd done. The prosecution opened with the video. No commentary. No soundtrack. Just 40 seconds of silence and impact. It played on a large monitor in full clarity. Danielle walking, the cruiser pulling up, the shove, the fall, the kick. You could hear her scream. You could hear the thud of her body hitting the sidewalk. You could hear the shock in the voices of people who watched it happen. No one spoke as the video ended. You didn't need to. Some members of the jury shifted uncomfortably. A few wiped at their eyes. Malik kept his gaze forward, steady, refusing to look away. Witnesses came next. A nurse who had treated Danielle. A bystander who had filmed the incident. A young woman who had called 911, her voice breaking slightly as she described what she saw. And then came the OB-GYN, explaining what could have happened if the kick had landed even slightly differently. The words were clinical but heavy. Risk of placental abruption. Oxygen deprivation. Fetal distress. Danielle had survived. The baby had survived. But not without damage. Then it was Danielle's turn. Malik stood as she rose and walked slowly to the witness stand. The room watched every step. She didn't rush. Her voice was soft but unwavering. She spoke about that day with a kind of grace that stilled the air. She talked about walking home with a bag of oranges. About how the officer approached her like she was a threat. About how she tried to de-escalate, tried to stay calm, told him she was pregnant, pleaded without shouting. And then how, without warning, he shoved her and kicked her. She remembered the way the pain shot through her, how she curled instinctively to shield her stomach. How she thought she had lost her child. Her voice cracked once, but she never looked away from the jury. The defense tried to spin a narrative, claimed Keller felt threatened, that Danielle had been non-compliant, that the video didn't show the whole story. But no one in the room believed it. The footage spoke louder than the excuses. The courtroom wasn't buying fear as justification. Not this time. When the prosecution gave their closing argument, Tanya Blake stood tall at the center of the room. Her voice was clear and simple. You don't need a law degree to know what you saw. You don't need training to know right from wrong. This wasn't protocol. This wasn't confusion. It was violence. Unjust, unprovoked, and deliberate. The jury deliberated for just over 3 hours. When they returned, the silence in the room was thick enough to feel. Malik held Danielle's hand tighter. The foreperson stood, cleared her throat, and read the verdict. Guilty. On all counts. Danielle let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. Malik closed his eyes, just for a second. Around them, the courtroom exhaled together. There was no applause. No cheering. Just a deep, shared silence. The kind that follows truth finally being recognized. Outside, the news broke quickly. Headlines flew across social media. Officer convicted in assault on pregnant woman. Justice for Danielle Harris. But for Malik and Danielle, it wasn't about headlines. It was about something quieter, something deeper. It was about walking into that courtroom with dignity and walking out with truth on their side. It didn't erase the pain. It didn't undo the trauma. But it was a step. A real one. And for the first time in months, they allowed themselves to breathe. The verdict brought relief, but Malik and Danielle knew justice didn't end in the courtroom. A guilty conviction was important. It sent a message. But the deeper work, the kind that changed lives, was only beginning. They had seen the system up close, how it stalled, deflected, protected itself at every turn. They had seen how easily someone could be ignored, how silence could swallow the truth if you weren't loud enough, focused enough, relentless enough. So instead of stepping back, they stepped forward. They took the momentum and built something out of it. They called it the Harris Project for Justice. It started in a small office near the center of Wilmington, just a few blocks from where the attack had happened. The walls were bare at first, except for a large photo of Danielle holding Truth in the hospital, both of them wrapped in light. Malik hung it on the wall because it reminded him of why they were doing this. Not for media, not for politics, but for the families who hadn't been heard. The ones still waiting. The ones who had given up. The project offered 3 things: legal support for families impacted by police violence, community-led policy proposals focused on real reform, and trauma counseling for survivors. Danielle insisted on the counseling component. She knew what it felt like to walk around with fear pressed against your ribs, to flinch when a door opened too fast, to wonder if speaking up would only make things worse. No one had prepared her for that part, and she wanted to make sure no one else went through it alone. Malik worked on the advocacy side, meeting with local officials, pushing for new policies, building alliances. He wasn't trying to be a politician. He was just a man who refused to let his family's pain be reduced to a headline. He had a way of speaking that made people stop scrolling and start listening. He didn't blame. He pointed to the documents, the data, the patterns, the people in power who looked the other way. He made it hard for anyone to pretend they didn't see. Danielle, in the meantime, found her own rhythm. She partnered with doulas, clinics, and maternal health advocates to create resources for Black women during pregnancy. She shared her story in small rooms first, church basements, women's shelters, high school classrooms. Each time she spoke, she watched other women sit up straighter, nod slowly, whisper thank you after it was over. She wasn't just telling her story to be heard. She was telling it to make space. For others. For healing. For hard conversations no one wanted to have but everyone needed. Truth was growing fast. He had started walking, barefoot, curious, always a few steps ahead of where his parents expected him to be. Malik joked that it was in his blood. That this boy, born in the middle of fire, would always run toward the light. Every time Danielle watched him play in the backyard, she felt something shift in her chest. Not fear. Not sadness. But strength. This little boy had survived something the world tried to turn its eyes away from. And now he was laughing under the sun. They held their first community meeting 6 weeks after the sentencing. Over 400 people showed up. Some had driven from out of state. Others came alone, unsure of what to expect. Malik stood at the front of the room with Truth strapped to his chest, asleep under a soft blanket. He didn't speak like a politician. He spoke like a father. He told them that justice wasn't a destination, it was a choice. A practice. A decision you made every single day, even when it was easier not to. And then he looked around the room and told them that they mattered. That their stories mattered. That their presence was part of the solution. By the end of the night, the air in the room had changed. People didn't just feel heard, they felt called. Called to care, to act, to stand up in their own corners of the world. And that was the point. Malik and Danielle weren't trying to be heroes. They were trying to make sure no one else had to walk through the same fire alone. They had turned their pain into purpose, and now they were building a legacy. One that would last longer than the trial, louder than the verdict. One built on truth. On healing. On love that didn't just survive, but transformed. A year had passed since that sidewalk became the breaking point. Since the video captured what words couldn't. Since the courtroom rang with a verdict that rarely came. Life had changed in more ways than Malik and Danielle could count, but somehow they had found a rhythm again. New, imperfect, but full of meaning. Their son, Truth, had grown into a bright, curious toddler who moved through the world with fearless joy, completely unaware of the storm he had survived. And in his laughter, in his tiny feet running across the living room floor, they found daily reminders of what they were still fighting for. The Harris Project had grown beyond their expectations. What started in a small office had turned into something bigger. Something real. Volunteers came in daily, some answering phones, others sitting with families who didn't know where else to go. The wall behind the front desk was covered in notes, photos, thank you letters, and names. Some were stories of justice. Others were still waiting. But every name mattered. Every visit reminded Danielle why she kept showing up. She wasn't there to fix everything. No one could. She was there to look people in the eye and say, I believe you. And sometimes, that was enough to begin healing. Malik stayed busy too. The Harris Project wasn't just a symbol anymore. It was an engine. They had helped pass local legislation requiring body cam footage to be released within 10 days of any use of force incident. They'd filed civil suits, supported exonerations, and trained young leaders on how to advocate in their own neighborhoods. And even though he was now being asked to speak in cities across the country, Malik always returned home to Danielle and Truth. He needed that grounding. The cause mattered. But so did bedtime stories and quiet mornings with coffee and crayons scattered on the table. One of their proudest moments came quietly. Danielle had organized a support circle for young mothers, many of them black women navigating pregnancy without consistent care or safety. It wasn't in a fancy building. Just a room in a church basement with folding chairs and strong tea. But the stories shared in that circle, stories of fear, of loss, of survival, built something sacred. Danielle didn't try to be an expert. She simply told the truth. About what had happened to her. About what almost didn't survive. And then she listened. Really listened. And that made all the difference. Truth's first birthday wasn't just a celebration of a child, it was a milestone for an entire movement. They hosted a block party that brought out the whole neighborhood. Musicians played. Families danced. Local restaurants donated food. Rosa, David, and a few city officials showed up, not for a photo op, but just to be present. Malik stood near the grill, watching Danielle laugh with friends as Truth toddled between adults handing him pieces of watermelon. For the first time in a long while, Malik allowed himself to breathe. Not because the work was over. It never would be. But because joy was resistance too. And they had earned it. In the months that followed, the Harris Project began partnering with universities and policy groups. They launched mentorship programs and began training young people to run for local office. Malik was invited to speak at a law enforcement conference, something he never imagined saying yes to, but he went. Not to accuse, but to challenge. To speak plainly about what silence costs, about what leadership should look like, and to remind even those in uniform that justice isn't about punishment, it's about protection, accountability, and care. He didn't expect everyone to agree. And that was okay. Progress wasn't about perfection. It was about persistence. Danielle reminded him of that every time he got tired. Every time the weight of it all felt like too much. She would look at him, smile softly, and say, "You're not carrying this alone." And she was right. They weren't alone anymore. Not in grief. Not in purpose. Not in hope. They had turned a single painful moment into a movement built on truth. And from that truth, they built something lasting. They didn't erase the past. They honored it. They used it. They chose to plant seeds instead of carry ashes. And as Truth ran barefoot across a patch of grass in their backyard, chasing butterflies under a wide Carolina sky, Malik and Danielle stood watching, side by side, hand in hand, knowing in their bones that this wasn't the end. This was the beginning. Life teaches us that justice is not just found in courtrooms. It's built day by day in the way we show up for one another, especially when it's hard. Malik and Danielle's journey reminds us that pain can either silence us or shape us into something stronger. Even when the system feels too big, too slow, or too broken, one voice, spoken with love, clarity, and courage, can spark change. For older audiences who've lived through decades of history, this story is a call to remember that it's never too late to lead with integrity, to protect those who come after us, and to turn our own trials into legacies of hope. Whether you're a parent, a grandparent, or simply someone who's seen your share of storms, know this: your voice still matters. Your story still matters. And your actions still shape the world around you. Justice isn't something we wait for. It's something we pass on. If this story moved you, take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments. What stories or topics would you like to see us explore next? Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss the conversations that matter most. Together, let's keep building a world where truth has the final word.